When my father passed away, I thought grief would be the hardest part to face. But then his will revealed one final requested DNA test for me and my sister. What that test uncovered shattered everything I thought I knew about my family and exposed a secret my mother had buried for 34 years. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I still remember the exact moment my world shifted. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old leather and coffee, the kind of place that should have felt steady and familiar. Instead, it was suffocating. My hands were clasped tightly in my lap, my knuckles white, as I sat beside my mother and sister waiting for the reading of my father's will. I had braced myself for the usual division of property, instructions about the house, maybe some sentimental letters he'd left behind. I thought the hardest part would be hearing his words spoken in the past tense. But then the lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and read aloud a sentence that seemed to hang in the air like a bomb ready to explode. It is my final request that both of my children undergo a DNA test before the inheritance is settled. The room froze. My mother stiffened immediately, her lips pressed into a hard line. My sister let out a sharp laugh, the kind people use when they're caught off guard and want to mask their discomfort with arrogance. I just sat there, stunned, feeling the floor tilt beneath me. Why would my father demand something like that? What could have driven him to make such a request? My father was not a man given to paranoia or theatrics. If he wrote this into his will, it meant he had carried suspicion with him for your suspicions serious enough that he chose to let the truth surface only after he was gone. I glanced at my mother. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a silent warning, as though she were daring me to say anything, to even breathe the wrong way. My sister, on the other hand, was indignant. "This is ridiculous," she snapped at the lawyer. "My father trusted me more than anyone. He wouldn't humiliate me like this." Her words hit me in an odd way. Trusted her more than anyone. That was always the story she told herself and maybe even believed. But here we were, with his final words proving the opposite. As the weight of that sentence settled over me, I felt two conflicting emotions tug at my chest. On one hand, grief that my father had carried such doubts with him all the way to his deathbed. On the other, a strange flicker of vindication. For years I had watched my sister bathe in his attention, dismiss me as the less important child, and wield her status like a weapon. If my father had suspected something all along, then maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the overlooked daughter I thought I was. Still, the moment was too raw, too confusing to fully process. I sat there in silence, aware that this single demand, this one DNA test, was about to change the course of my entire family's story. In order to understand how heavy that moment felt, you need to know what our family looked like before the lawyer ever read those words aloud. On the surface, we appeared ordinary enough to parents, to children. A modest but comfortable life. But underneath, there were cracks that only widened with time. I'll start with myself. I've always been the steady one, the one who followed the rules, stayed out of trouble, and kept my head down. I wasn't the loudest or the boldest, but I was dependable. I worked hard in school, then in my career, and I made choices that reflected the lessons my father drilled into me. Honesty, responsibility, and fairness. People often told me I had his eyes and his quiet determination. It was a small comfort, because in many ways, I lived in the shadow of someone else. That someone else was my sister. From as far back as I can remember, she was the star of the household. She demanded attention, and she got it. She had a way of making her presence known in every room, whether it was through laughter that bordered on shrill, or tantrums that left everyone exhausted. My mother adored her, doted on her, shielded her from consequences. And my father, though sterner, often gave in to her as well, perhaps just to keep the peace. It wasn't that I was unloved. I know my father respected me in his quiet way. But my sister was indulged, almost as though the family revolved around her orbit. Birthdays, holidays, even casual dinners seemed to tilt in her favor. If she wanted something, we all adjusted. If she failed at something, excuses were made. If I succeeded, it was noticed, but not celebrated. My mother played a key role in that imbalance. She was warm when she wanted to be, but she had a sharp edge whenever my sister's shortcomings were exposed. I saw her cover for her countless times. Forgotten homework mysteriously completed. Broken promises smoothed over with charming excuses. Even outright lies told to neighbors and relatives to protect her from embarrassment. At the time, I told myself that was just how mothers were with their favorites. But in hindsight, I see it as a pattern, a web of protection spun around my sister at all costs. And then there was my father. He wasn't an affectionate man in the traditional sense. He didn't shower us with hugs or doting words. Instead, he expressed himself through expectations. He taught me how to keep a checkbook, how to repair a leaky faucet, how to think before I spoke. He often reminded me that character is what you do when no one's watching. Those lessons stuck with me. But I also remember the moments when his eyes narrowed at my sister. Times when her stories didn't quite add up, or when she dismissed his authority with too much confidence. He never said much, never accused. But there was a tension there, like he was filing something away in the back of his mind. Looking back, I realized that was my first warning sign. My father, for all his sternness, was not blind. He noticed things, and while he rarely confronted them directly, he had a way of preparing, of waiting. In the years leading up to his death, life carried on with this uneven rhythm. I worked and built a life of my own, always tethered in some way to the family dynamics I couldn't quite escape. My sister floated from one opportunity to another, cushioned by my mother's constant defense and encouragement. And Dad, well, he remained steady, but with a distance I didn't fully understand until after he was gone. That was the normal world. Unequal, yes, but familiar. I had learned to live with it, to accept my place. At least, I thought I had, until the will was read, and all those cracks suddenly became gaping holes. The lawyer's voice was calm, almost clinical, as he repeated my father's request for DNA testing. But the atmosphere in that room was anything but calm. My sister reacted first, her face twisted into disbelief, then rage. "This is humiliating," she shouted, slamming her hand on the polished wooden table. "How dare you suggest something like this? My father trusted me. He loved me. He would never write such garbage into his will." Her outburst startled me, but what shook me even more was my mother's response. She didn't look shocked. She didn't even look confused. She immediately leaned forward, her voice sharp and protective, as though she had been preparing for this very moment. "This is an outrage," she snapped at the lawyer. "My husband was not in his right mind when he wrote that. He was sick, confused. This clause should be ignored." I sat in silence, watching the two of them unravel. A strange heaviness settled in my chest. My father had always been precise, deliberate. He didn't scribble things into his will lightly. If he included this, it wasn't confusion, it was certainty. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Khan was perfectly lucid when he signed these documents, he said firmly. He was insistent that this condition be carried out before the distribution of assets. My sister scoffed, throwing herself back in her chair, arms crossed like a child refusing to eat her vegetables. This is beneath me. I won't be paraded around like some criminal, swabbing my mouth for your amusement. The lawyer didn't flinch. If you choose not to comply, you forfeit your share of the inheritance. Those were his explicit instructions. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade, ready to drop. For a moment, no one spoke. My mother's face flushed, her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. My sister looked at me with blazing eyes, as if somehow this was my doing, as if I had planted the idea in Dad's mind. And me? I sat there, my pulse steady but my thoughts racing. This was at the moment the fragile balance of our family life tipped into chaos. I realized, with chilling clarity, that my father must have known something all along. For decades, he had carried a suspicion deep in his heart, and he chose to reveal it not with accusations while alive, but with undeniable proof after his death. It was the single, unforgivable demand. The line had been crossed. There would be no going back to the way things were in that instant. Grief was replaced by something else: anticipation, dread, maybe even a quiet hope. Because if my father had gone this far, then whatever truth he suspected was about to come crashing into the light. The days that followed felt like walking through a storm that refused to end. At first, I thought my sister's anger would burn out quickly, that she'd reluctantly agree to the DNA test just to secure her share of the inheritance. But I underestimated the depth of her pride and my mother's determination to shield her at any cost. My phone rang constantly. Sometimes it was my sister, her voice dripping with venom. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she accused me one evening. "You always resented that Dad loved me more, and now you're happy to drag me through the mud. You're pathetic." Other times it was my mother, her tone softer but no less manipulative. "Sweetheart," she sighed, "you know your father was unwell. He didn't mean this. You don't want to dishonor his memory by feeding into some paranoid delusion, do you?" Each call left me more unsettled. I wanted to shout at them, to remind them that this wasn't my idea, that it was Dad's will, the last echo of his voice. But I held my tongue. Deep down, I sensed that arguing would only fuel their fire. The lawyer, steady as ever, reminded us of the deadline. The DNA tests had to be completed within 2 weeks. If either party refuses, he repeated, their claim is void. My sister continued to resist, telling anyone who would listen that the clause was illegal and unconstitutional. She even tried to rally support from extended family. At a cousin's dinner, she stood up and declared, "My father's mind was poisoned against me. This is nothing but an attempt to rob me of what's rightfully mine." I watched relatives shift uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting to me, silently asking what was really going on. I said little, just nodded and sipped my tea. There was no need to fight her in public. Truth has a way of defending itself. But the rumors spread anyway. Whispers floated back to me through mutual friends. People were speculating about infidelity, about hidden scandals. Some pitied my sister. Others looked at me with cautious curiosity, as though I might reveal some hidden chapter of our family's story. The tension in our home was unbearable. Every time I visited my mother, I was met with cold glares and thinly veiled threats. "If you love this family," she said one afternoon, her voice trembling, "you'll tell the lawyer to drop this nonsense." But the more they resisted, the more certain I became. My father hadn't written that clause on a whim. He had known maybe not the full truth, but enough to be sure that this test was necessary And so, under the weight of the looming deadline, my sister finally relented. She stormed into the clinic with Mom at her side, hurling insults at the receptionist and rolling her eyes as the nurse swabbed her cheek. "This is barbaric," she muttered loud enough for everyone in the waiting room to hear. I sat quietly through my own test, heart pounding but face calm. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing at the edge of a cliff. And once those results came in, there would be no climbing back. When the call came from the lawyer's office, my stomach twisted into knots. He didn't reveal the results over the phone, only asked us to come in person. That alone told me this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. The three of us, my mother, my sister, and I, sat in that office once again. The leather chairs felt stiffer this time, the air heavier. My sister fidgeted impatiently, tapping her manicured nails against the armrest. My mother sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on some invisible point on the wall. I forced myself to breathe evenly, though my heart raced. The lawyer opened a thin folder and adjusted his glasses. "The results are in," he said plainly. "The test confirms that you," he nodded at me, "are Mr. Khan's biological child. However," his pause was deliberate, "the test also confirms that your sister is not." For a moment, there was silence. Pure, suffocating silence. Then my sister let out a harsh laugh. "That's ridiculous. Completely wrong. These tests make mistakes all the time." But the lawyer shook his head. "The lab we used is accredited and highly reliable. The results are conclusive." I looked at my mother then, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. She didn't look surprised. Not in the least. Instead, her lips trembled, her face drained of color, and her eyes darted toward me with a mixture of panic and defiance. "This is nonsense," she said finally, her voice sharp. "Your father was a good man, but he wasn't perfect. He let his suspicions cloud his judgment. That's all. This is a mistake fueled by paranoia." My sister's face twisted in rage. "So what? Even if this ridiculous test says he's not my father, he raised me. He provided for me. That makes him my father, and I deserve what's mine." Her words struck me like a blade. "He raised me. Yes, he did. He gave her love, food, shelter, everything a father could give. And now she was reducing him to a mere provider, dismissing the man who had built his life on principles of honor and truth." A cold knot formed in my stomach. I had sat through years of favoritism, endured the sting of being overlooked while she basked in his attention. And now, in the moment of truth, she had the audacity to spit on his memory because it no longer served her. I realized then that there would be no reconciliation, no heartfelt confession, no apology from either of them. My mother's silence was an admission in itself, and my sister's outrage was proof that she valued entitlement over truth. That was my breaking point. Sitting there, watching them twist and writhe in the face of undeniable evidence, I felt something inside me harden. The girl who had tolerated years of second place was gone. I would no longer stay quiet, no longer swallow the lies to keep the peace. If Dad had trusted me enough to leave this clause in his will, then I owed it to him to see it through. As my sister ranted and my mother muttered excuses, the lawyer cleared his throat again. His calm voice cut through their chaos like a blade. "There's one more matter," he said, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "Mr. Khan left this letter with explicit instructions. It was to be opened only if the DNA results confirmed his suspicions." The room fell silent. For the first time since the reading of the will, my sister stopped talking. My mother's hand twitched as though she wanted to snatch the letter before it reached me. But the lawyer's steady gaze froze her in place. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal. The paper inside carried my father's familiar, deliberate handwriting. I had to steady my breathing before I began to read. My dearest child, it began. If you are reading this, then what I suspected has been proven true. For many years, I held my tongue for the sake of keeping peace in our home. But I cannot leave this world without ensuring that the truth guides what comes after me. My chest tightened as I read on. He wrote of suspicions that had gnawed at him for decades, small inconsistencies. Stories that didn't align, a distance he had never been able to bridge with my sister. He admitted he had considered confronting my mother but chose silence, unwilling to tear apart the family while he lived. But then came the line that seared itself into my memory. Silence in life was my compromise. But in death, I will not compromise with lies. My estate shall pass only to my blood. This is not punishment, but justice. Let the truth decide what is fair. I set the letter down, my hands trembling. My sister's face was red with fury. This is a setup, she shrieked. He was manipulated into writing this. My mother leaned forward, her voice low and trembling with rage. He had no right to leave words like that behind. But their protests fell flat. The letter was clear, precise, unshakable. And in that moment, I realized something my father had understood all along. Words written on paper, backed by legal force, were stronger than any tantrum or denial. That was my weapon, not a trick, not manipulation, but my father's own foresight. He had placed the truth in my hands, and with it, the power to honor his values and shield myself from their endless deceit. As my sister shouted and my mother seethed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't at the mercy of their lies. I had proof. I had Dad's final words, and I was ready to use them. The next meeting with the lawyer was nothing short of a battlefield. My mother and sister arrived dressed in dark, somber clothes, as if mourning could substitute for dignity. Their faces carried a mix of defiance and desperation, but I noticed the subtle details. My mother's clenched jaw, my sister's darting eyes. They weren't here to grieve. They were here to fight. The lawyer welcomed us with the same even tone as before, though I didn't miss the faint tightening around his eyes. He knew what was coming. After the last meeting, he had requested our presence again, this time with additional witnesses from the firm. I realized then that he anticipated resistance, perhaps even a scene, and he was right. Before he could speak, my sister slammed her palm on the table. "This will is invalid," she shouted. He wasn't in his right mind when he wrote it. Everyone knows Dad adored me just as much as her. Why should some ridiculous test strip away everything I deserve? I stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air. I had learned long ago that my silence provoked her more than any argument ever could. The lawyer simply lifted his hand. "Miss Khan," he said, calm but firm, "your father's will is valid and binding. His mental capacity was evaluated at the time of its signing. We have multiple witnesses and medical records confirming it. Unless you intend to take this to court, his wishes stand." My sister's face twisted. She looked at my mother, silently urging her to intervene. And she did. "You can't do this," my mother hissed at me. Her voice was low, sharp enough to cut through the air. "Do you think you'll survive if you turn us away? Do you think money and property will fill the void when you're left completely alone? Families stick together, no matter what. Your father was cruel, and you don't have to continue his cruelty." Her words might have shaken me once, but not now, not with the letter in my hand. I laid it gently on the table, facing them. "This isn't me," I said, my voice steady. "This is Dad. His words. His choice." The lawyer leaned forward, unfolding the letter and reading it aloud in full. Every sentence struck like a gavel. My father's voice, preserved in ink, filled the room with more authority than my mother's pleas or my sister's tantrums ever could. When he finished, silence followed. A heavy, suffocating silence. My sister's eyes brimmed with tears, though whether they were of grief or humiliation, I couldn't tell. My mother stared at the table, her knuckles white. Finally, the lawyer spoke again. The estate will be executed according to Mr. Khan's will. If you wish to contest, you may file suit. But I warn you, the DNA results in this letter make your position very weak. I could see the fight draining out of them. My sister slumped back in her chair, her rage replaced with a hollow glare. My mother closed her eyes, her lips pressed together in a thin line in that moment. I understood what my father had given me. Not just an inheritance, not just property. He had given me freedom. He had given me the strength to stand against the people who had tried for years to manipulate me, silence me, diminish me. This was my turning point. And there's the moment the letter was read and the lawyer's words sealed my father's decision. I saw something I'd never seen before in my mother and sister. Powerlessness. For years, they had operated like a two-person storm, sweeping through life with entitlement and manipulation, convinced the world would bend to their will. But here, in this office, with my father's signature and the DNA test as unshakable evidence, their storm hit a wall my sister was the first to crack. She shoved her chair back so hard it screeched against the tiled floor. "You'll regret this," she spat, pointing at me with trembling fingers. "You think this makes you the winner? You'll end up miserable and alone, just like him. Nobody will stand by you when you're greedy and cold." Her voice was shrill, but underneath the fury, I heard something new: fear. The certainty she had lived with her entire life, that she could scream or cry or demand her way into comfort, had evaporated. For once, her threats sounded hollow, even to her own ears. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My mother, though, was different. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She leaned forward, her eyes boring into mine with the intensity of someone cornered. "After everything I gave you," she said in a voice so calm it chilled me, "this is how you repay me. You think your father was a saint. He was cruel. He was stubborn. And now you're carrying out his cruelty. Mark my words, you'll regret siding with a dead man over your own mother." It was the last card she had left to play. Guilt. The same guilt she had used on me since I was a child. The same guilt that kept me silent when she favored my sister. The same guilt that convinced me to step aside, time and time again. But it didn't work anymore. I looked at her steadily and said, "No, Mother. I'm not siding with Dad. I'm siding with the truth." For a flicker of a second, I saw her mask break. A sharp intake of breath, a tightening around her eyes. She knew it was over. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Ladies, if there are no further legal objections, I must ask you to leave. The estate proceedings will continue without interruption." That was it. The gavel had fallen. My sister stormed out first, muttering curses under her breath, her heels striking the floor in rapid, angry beats. My mother stayed a moment longer, staring at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher, part rage, part betrayal, and perhaps a trace of something she would never admit: shame. Then, without a word, she gathered her purse and followed my sister out. When the door shut behind them, the silence in the room felt different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was liberating. I sat back in my chair, letting out a long breath I didn't realize I had been holding. For the first time in 34 years, they no longer had power over me. Their downfall wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't the kind of scene you see in movies where villains are dragged out in handcuffs. No, it was something better. It was quiet, final, and undeniable. They had been defeated by their own lies, the very foundation of their lives crumbling beneath them. And I hadn't lifted a finger, except to hold my father's letter. The real satisfaction didn't come in the lawyer's office, though watching my mother and sister walk out empty-handed was a moment I'll never forget. The true payoff came later, when the estate transfer was finalized and every loose end tied itself neatly into place. A few weeks after that explosive meeting, I received a sealed envelope from the lawyer. Inside was the official confirmation, the deed to the family house, the investment accounts, and the farmland my father had tended with such pride were now solely mine. Every signature, every document bore the stamp of finality. There was no more room for debate, no chance of an appeal. I remember holding the deed to the house in my hands, running my fingers over the embossed seal. For years, I had tiptoed through those hallways as if I were a guest in my own home. My mother had made sure of that, favoring my sister in every way possible, making me feel like I was only tolerated, never truly wanted. And yet here I was, the rightful heir, entrusted by my father to carry forward what he had built. That evening, I walked through the house alone. The walls felt different, no longer echoing with the sharpness of arguments or the heaviness of secrets. I paused in my father's study, the room where he had drafted his will, where he had chosen truth over illusion. Sitting at his desk, I whispered, "Thank you, Dad. You saw me, even when they didn't." The final, undeniable victory came not in what I gained, but in what they lost. Word spread quickly in our extended family and community. Everyone knew the truth now, that my sister was not my father's child, and that my mother had concealed it for 34 years. The whispers turned into open conversations, and soon my mother and sister could no longer hide behind their usual facade. Invitations dwindled. Friends kept their distance. The sympathy they once commanded had turned into pity, even scorn. It was karmic justice in its purest form. They had spent decades trying to manipulate appearances, but in the end, their own lies stripped them of the image they worked so hard to maintain. The most satisfying moment came when my sister, after weeks of silence, sent me a message. Short, bitter, full of the venom I had come to expect. "Enjoy it while it lasts. Nothing good ever comes from stolen blood money." For the first time in my life, I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The inheritance wasn't stolen. It was justice. It was my father's voice from beyond the grave, saying he trusted me to carry on his legacy, not the lies that had poisoned our family for decades. I deleted her message, closed my phone, and went outside to sit on the porch. The sun was setting over the land that was now mine, and mine alone. For the first time, I felt the weight lift completely. I had won, not through revenge or cruelty, but through truth. That was the moment I knew the battle was truly over. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a rhythm I had never experienced before, one free of constant tension and second-guessing. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for manipulation, guilt, or another exhausting round of favoritism. The estate proceedings concluded smoothly. The lawyer, now less stern and more supportive, congratulated me on handling the process with dignity. His words mattered more than I expected. For so long, I had been painted as the outsider in my own family, and now an impartial professional had affirmed what my father had already declared. I was worthy. The house became my sanctuary. I redecorated slowly, not in drastic ways but in meaningful ones. I replaced the heavy curtains my mother had insisted on with lighter fabrics that let in the sun. I framed photographs of my father, candid ones, not the stiff portraits, so his smile would greet me in the mornings. The house began to feel less like a battleground and more like a home. As for my mother and sister, their downfall unfolded quietly but relentlessly. My sister, who once boasted about her perfect family, now struggled to maintain even the illusion. Her husband, weary of the drama and the whispers surrounding her parentage, grew distant. I heard through the grapevine that he had suggested moving away for a fresh start, though everyone knew he simply wanted to escape the shame. My mother, once a figure of authority in our extended family, found her influence evaporating. Relatives who once deferred to her now kept their distance, unwilling to be dragged into her bitterness. Even those who sympathized could not ignore the betrayal she had hidden for 34 years. Her voice, once commanding, carried no weight anymore. I didn't revel in their suffering, but I won't pretend I pitied them either. Their downfall was the natural consequence of their choices. My father had given them every chance to come clean, to face the truth with dignity. Instead, they clung to lies until the very end. And lies, no matter how carefully constructed, always collapse. For me, the greatest gift wasn't the house, the land, or the accounts. It was freedom. Freedom from the roles they had forced on me. Freedom from the shadow of favoritism. Freedom from the endless guilt trips. In quiet moments, I would sit on the porch and think about the irony of it all. For decades, my mother and sister believed they were untouchable, that their control over appearances and narratives would last forever. But in the end, it was a simple test, a strip of DNA evidence, that unraveled everything. The moral is one my father must have known when he drafted his will. The truth always finds its way to the surface. Lies can live for years, even decades, but eventually, reality demands to be seen. And when it does, justice follows. As for me, I now live in peace, carrying my father's legacy forward with pride. His final act not only secured my future but also restored the balance that had been missing from our family for far too long. In the end, it wasn't revenge, it was justice. And justice, when it finally arrives, is the sweetest inheritance of all. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.